Hello, dear viewers. This is George from Ireland, continuing my series about the Northern Irish Troubles, left off in 1979. One of the things I was talking about previously was about the IRA's espionage inside the Crown Forces. One of the things they were highly effectual at doing was finding out some very personal information about soldiers, going up to the street, greeting a soldier by name, telling him his home address, the names of his wife and children. And this sort of psychological warfare, as you can imagine, very much discomforted the soldiers at the time. So they may have well had spies inside the British Army, or in the 80s, the IRA were getting IT savvy. They got some of their sympathisers, maybe not members of the IRA as such, to join various public institutions of civil service and skill up in terms of IT. More government records have been put onto computer. It had all been index card up until that time. So that was that. Now, Catholics who joined the UDR, there are very few of them, they reported that there was some anti-Catholic prejudice in the UDR, and sometimes people would be suspicious towards them. Is this person passing information to the IRA? It's obviously not beyond the bounds the possibility that some of them were. Now, all of them could be innocent bar one. It would still be true that one of them was a spy, and that's the terrible thing. There's a sense of mistrust that espionage causes. Likewise, Catholics in the RUC might have experienced the same thing. The thing is, the UDR was drawn from a certain demographic, overwhelmingly young Protestant men of unionist or loyalist opinions, the same demographic from which the loyalist terrorist organisations recruited, working class in most cases. So, unsurprisingly, some of them shared the prejudices which were known to be amongst loyalists, less so amongst unionists. As I say, there always were Catholics in the Ulster Unionist Party, just very few. In The Price of My Soul, Bernadette Devlin mentions Bill O'Hara, a Catholic unionist. Louis Boyle, in the early 70s, had ambitions of being an Ulster Unionist MP. But anyway, he didn't get anywhere. So back to politics a little bit more. Paisley was in the European Parliament, as I said. In 1979, the Pope visited the Republic of Ireland. Apparently, the Loyalist terrorists said they did not object to him visiting Northern Ireland. There's a book entitled The UVF by Henry MacDonald and Jack Holland, which is the standard reference text in it. I don't know of any book on the UDA as such. But anyway, when the Pope went to Scotland a few years later, Paisley was there to protest, and the Pope was late for one of his engagements. And an Anglican clergyman said, "Well, Dr. Paisley, maybe your protest has put the Pope off." And Paisley tapped his watch, saying, "He's not so infallible now." Paisley was deliberately misrepresenting the doctrine of papal infallibility. It's been invoked only twice, that the Pope cannot be wrong on certain doctrines. I think one of them is the assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The IRA couldn't kill large numbers of members of the security forces, could sustain the campaign and manage the occasional spectacular. Well, August 1979, it achieved 2 coups in one day. Lord Mountbatten went on holiday to the Republic of Ireland, had done so every year for decades. He was a distant cousin of the Queen, former Viceroy of India and all that. And he said he loathed extremism of all kinds. Anyway, he went out in his yacht, Shadow 5, and it was blown up by a bomb. He and 2 of his relatives and a local boy were all killed. So the IRA did that. Jerry Adams, in Unpublished, which was the house journal of the IRA, he wrote his approval of this murder. Now, Rory O'Broader, sometime IRA chief of staff, said it was a military operation and entirely acceptable, chuckled about it. Well, it can't have been military since Earl Mountbatten was a civilian. He was a 79-year-old. He was unarmed. He wasn't military at all. Now, he had been a naval officer decades before. But if the IRA felt obliged to kill Lord Mountbatten, they could have just shot him. They could have killed him in a way which didn't endanger anyone else, but they chose to kill 3 other civilians, including an Irish child. So much for defending the Irish civilian population. That same day, the IRA set off a bomb at Warren Point in County Down, and they managed to kill 18 members of the parachute regiment, and had a particular grudge towards them because of the 30th of January 1972. The IRA had very carefully studied how the British Army responded to situations. One roadside bomb under a hay cart and then the soldiers got out and they set up an incident control point, and that's where the second bomb was. The Paris thought they were being fired at from across narrow water, which is a stretch of water between County Down and the County Louth. Louth is in the Republic, and so the Paris fired back. They saw two men on the opposite shore. In fact, it was just must have been ammunition cooking off. The IRA said they actually didn't fire them at all. It was bombs only, and they killed two people. Turned out to be English tourists, in fact. So the IRA wrote graffiti that 14 dead, not forgotten. We got 18 and Mountbatten. So they were very satisfied with that day's work. Anfablicht had the headline, "I don't like Mondays," which was a hit by the Boomtown Rats at the time. So they also quipped that in Buckingham Palace, the servant would be saying there'll be one fewer for dinner. Sorry, one less for dinner, because they wrote it ungrammatically. So Margaret Thatcher came to Northern Ireland to see what the situation was. She was concerned about the level of casualties, but she had a firm attitude on many issues, and this was one of them. There was no sense that she was going to give up. So he had a funeral with great pomp, Lord Mountbatten. He was particularly close to his grandnephew, Prince Charles. So Margaret Thatcher was negotiating about Zimbabwean independence. The Lancaster House Conference went on from September to December 1979, shortly after she became Prime Minister. Now, the Republican movement liked to pretend that the Northern Ireland situation was analogous to that of an African colony, and so they took heart from this. Some of the extreme loyalists had links to the far right and dabbled with white supremacism. And way back in the 60s, O'Neill said, we can't have a UDI because some of us were saying we should do what Rhodesia is doing. It's now Zimbabwe, as in just declare independence, even without permission from London, and run the show ourselves. And O'Neill was saying, absolutely unacceptable, and we don't want to be a Protestant Sinn Féin. We don't want that, and it's impractical. So this was completely different, despite the Republicans trying to draw forth parallels, because London's policy since at least 1965 had been to grant legal independence to Zimbabwe on the basis of majority rule. Anyway, finally it was being achieved. So that was that. The hunger strikes started going again in 1980. The UK government had hinted at concessions through bank channels, but they weren't being granted. So hunger strikes generated considerable sympathy amongst the wider nationalist population in the south as well as the north. Catholic clergy visited the prisons and complained about the conditions which the prisons had deliberately created. The hunger strikers, they were the ones smearing their excrement on the walls. So they were H blocks at the Maze prison because they're built in the shape of a letter H. And they're very modern, very humane. They had excellent medical care, obviously had plenty of food and whatever else. They could pursue education up to PhD level. And so it really was nauseating that they should whinge about their conditions. The IRA had occasionally taken prisoners, usually severely tortured them and killed them and so on. So it was flabbergasting that they should moan about suffering which they caused themselves. So the Irish government lobbied the UK government to make concessions. Feeling was running high in the Republic of Ireland. It was very hypocritical of Dublin because, of course, the Irish government had let several prisoners die on hunger strike in the 1920s, in the Second World War. Even De Valera, this Republican icon, had said, well, we'll let them die on hunger strike. So when Sean McSteephen, IRA Chief of Staff, had been on hunger strike in the South in 1973, the Irish government refused to budge. In fact, he'd been cheating, drinking water in the shower. But there was a lot of public pressure on the Irish government to do things. I should point out that the president at the time, Dr. Patrick Hillary, was Fianna Fáil, so more Republican sympathising, and Charles Haughey was Taoiseach at the time, and he was on the Fianna Fáil party as well, a fairly hardline nationalist. His father was from Tyrone. He had plenty of cousins in the north, and his father had been in the IRA in the 20s. Of course, a lot of people had been, and it then became mainstream to have had family in the IRA in the 20s if you're a politician in the south. So anyway, the Republic of Ireland had been going through a political crisis through much of the 70s and 80s. Presidents changing, Carullo Dorler resigning because an army officer was impolite, and the defence minister was impolite to him and wasn't sacked, and the other one, Erskine Childers, dying in office. Finally, Dr. Hillary was there as president, and swapping between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, Taoiseach. But anyway, March 1981, the hunger strikes began. Bobby Sands was going to go first. He's a Belfast man. He was imprisoned for possession of unlicensed loaded firearm and burning down a furniture shop. So he was married, he had a little son, but he wasn't willing to live for his child. So St. Patrick's Day was part of his hunger strike, and he got worse and worse, and after about 10 weeks he died. It was May 1981, and during that time Tom Barry died. Well, so I better talk about the consequences of some of these hunger strike deaths in a minute.